Welcome to Resisting the Dragon's Beast. We're going to let Peter take over the show again because we're doing his top 10. Now we're doing the top five of his top 10. Right,
Yeah,
Peter?
top five of the top 10. We're still kind of in election recap, and so we'll just dive right in. Last time we talked about integrity and interest in our national debt, a little bit on impeachment. I mean, that one's still an open question, and I guess together with that, the other open question would be the question of the pardon for Hunter Biden, which apparently, in the little bit that I read, is unprecedented in the history of presidential pardons, in that it is a blanket pardon covering an entire decade. Read into that what you will. Indictment, also, talked about. We talked about that a little bit, and inflation, and the opportunity to talk about deeds of mercy within the church. And then we had begun last time, I think, on the warning that we don't take this as a stamp of approval from God, that we can't say anything about the will of God apart from the revealed word of God. So today, we're diving in with the top five of these top 10, and they get a little bit more philosophical, perhaps, philosophy. So the first one is foreign policy. And foreign policy, especially in the way that it is already being affected, even though Trump has not taken office. The biggest foreign policy thing that he's been talking about is tariffs. That's all over the news, and all sorts of discussion back and forth as to the effect that tariffs will have on our economy. But I don't know about you, Mike, but I love following Canadian politics from a distance.
Yep.
From a distance. And if you've got a couple minutes, just put it on in the background. Like, go to YouTube and search for their House of Parliament, especially the lower house, the House of Parliament, where they just have this discussion back and forth. And all it is the liberals saying that we're going to do something about this, and the conservatives saying you've had like 8 years of saying that you're going to do something and you haven't done anything. And but the biggest discussion coming out of that, when we're talking about Canada, when we talk about Canada, is that number one, 40% of Canada's GDP is due to trade with the United States. And so they already saw, and they've heard now, that a 25% tariff would absolutely destroy their economy. It would absolutely crush them. And I think Trump got a little snarky on Twitter, and when he talked with Justin Trudeau about proposing to annex Canada for a 51st or a 51st and 52nd state.
Well, yeah, he actually said that to his face.
Yeah.
They were having dinner at Mar-a-Lago, and it was a joke. And then he said, well, to Trudeau, you could be the governor of the state. And yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Some had said, yeah, except so much of Canada is liberal. And that's when Trump said, well, then we'll make it in two states, one that's conservative, one that is liberal.
And this is the most interesting thing about Trump, especially if you follow him a little bit. If you haven't seen the Al Smith banquet, the speech that he gave, absolutely hilarious. His whole shtick, his whole thing, is to say something preposterous and make you think that he's crazy enough to do it.
Yeah. And
And it
and that's the
works.
thing is, when he was president, that because people were saying about Trump, well, he's going to be a warmonger, he's going to do this thing or that thing. And what they forget is we have 4 years of evidence to look back on. Well, he did not do this, he did not do that. And one of the things he didn't do, and the only president in our lifetimes that did not start a war. And that part of it is because, his book, The Art of the Deal, which is something I may end up putting on my reading list for next year, is something I hate. I don't know what you feel about this, Peter. I hate going and shopping for vehicles because I'm very much, what's the price? That's the price. But that's not the way it is in when you're buying a vehicle. It's bartering. And
Mhm.
that's what Trump does is, he'll come down hard. He just said in a tweet also to uh, Hamas with their war with Israel is you better return these hostages or I'm going to rain down hell on you like you've never seen before. And so, Hamas is going to wonder what's going to happen. Same
Mhm.
thing with Putin. Putin did not invade Ukraine or anywhere else when Trump was there because Trump said, "Hey, if you do anything, I'm going to send nukes and missiles right into the Kremlin." And well, he probably won't do it. I'm going to guess Putin is thinking, but there's a 3% chance he could.
Yes.
And that's the art of the deal is you can always back down. But when you start something with weakness, is what we've seen with President Biden. When you start with weakness, you can't get stronger. It's something I learned from principals in at our school. The one principal told me you can start strong with discipline in the beginning of the school year, then you can get more lenient as you go on. You can't start lenient because you've lost the kids and then become stronger later on.
Yeah, and so the really interesting thing is if you watch some of these clips from Parliament, is 5 months ago the Liberal Party in Canada was laughing at the idea of Trump becoming president, and now they're absolutely panicking, and the Liberals are saying that we're going to fix our immigration problem because Trudeau has absolutely decimated their immigration system. And the conservatives said, just keep saying, where is your fix our border plan? Because they're all in a panic, and rightfully so, because they're like, Trump is going to crush our economy with these tariffs unless we secure our own border.
Mhm.
And so it's fascinating to see that here we are, it's over a month before he even takes office, and everybody around the world is saying, oh no, we got to get our ducks in a row or else we are going to be toast.
Yeah, Mexico. President Trump met with the lady who is the president of Mexico. Said the same thing about the border wall. You fix things, or yeah, we're not going to allow you to trade with us. We're going to level really hard tariffs on you. I'm going to guess the Canadian Parliament is freaking out when you're mentioning, illegal aliens. That one of the first things that Trump and his borders are, Tom Homan want to do then is we're going to get rid of these illegal aliens, the ones that especially that we've caught that are violent, that they're criminals. Well, and they'll eventually get to other people. Well, if those people who are here illegally in America, they realize, okay, they're going to be next. Well, where are they going to go? Well, they'll probably go north to Canada. And so now you've got another issue with Canada, or Canada has another issue. So what is the name of the guy who's running to go against Trudeau in a year or two?
Oh, Pierre Polivier. My only I don't speak French. My only hint for trying to speak French is basically speak English while trying to swallow your tongue at the same time. And so Pierre Polivier, however you pronounce it, and he's very. I mean, the Conservative Party in Canada is still not that conservative. It's just more conservative than the Liberals, and he's actually trying to kind of imitate Trump. There are some times when you get him in an interview and he's very cogent, thoughtful, and other times where he is just kind of like a train going off the rails, but he just keeps charging at the same main things that are the problem for all the Canadians. We're talking about economy that is in shambles. We're talking about immigration, and the cost of housing is through the roof.
Yeah, I've
So
I've
he,
listened to I've listened to a couple of things where he's talked to reporters. Yeah, and he doesn't take anything from them. My favorite, he's standing out in an orchard. He's chewing on an apple. Just keep taking bites, and he's just talking to these reporters. Just there's not a whole lot of respect that he has for them because they don't treat him with respect. But yeah, I like his conservative ideas, and then just the very frank way that he communicates those conservative ideas.
definitely. So I think those are the main things on foreign policy. I think my impression is that we're still, as a country, we're still trying to shuttle as much money, launder as much money or other material through Ukraine as possible until the day that Trump takes office. And it would be interesting to see if whether we're talking about Ukraine or Israel, if it's going to be similar to when Ronald Reagan took over from Jimmy Carter.
Hmm.
that the Iran-Contra, or the whatever it was, the Iranian embassy, U.S. embassy in Iran, had been taken over, and the hostage situation for 300 some days. And as Reagan is taking the oath of office, the hostages are on a plane coming back to the United States. Like at some
Exactly.
point, it's not a bad thing to have a little bit of crazy that people are like, yeah, I don't want to mess with this.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly it. And the same thing with the tariffs. And the big thing with the tariffs that I understand is that it's, uh, we have shipped so much of our manufacturing overseas because then we've helped make Americans wealthy because, our money, we're making more money because, something that costs, say, $2 here to make, well, it only costs like 20 cents over in China to make. Well, that's partly because, they're using slave labor and they're not paying people and so forth. But our corporations here are making money, but American citizens are not. And so what Trump is planning on doing with tariffs is, all right, bringing that stuff back into America, you're going to lose money because we're going to charge you that full $2 that would have taken you to make that. It's better to keep those jobs here, and then that's going to help our economy because our people, the citizens are making the money and not the owners of the companies and so forth. So that's why tariffs are so important. It's because other countries have tariffs on our products going into their countries, and so it's just creating a level playing field, as far as what I understand.
Yeah, that's kind of my understanding too. And a lot of these other countries also have government subsidies for these various industries, and so they artificially cut the cost by subsidizing it through their government, and then the tariff would be a way of leveraging that. And the only reason that the tariffs could possibly work is because the United States is probably, if not the biggest, because China and India are very, very large, but the biggest consumer culture, consumer economy in the world, arguably.
Hmm.
And the fact that that the free trade on the oceans is secured by the fact that we have Navy, our U.S. Navy is all over the world to protect the seas from piracy. And in a the sort of Team America World Police idea, I think there is some merit to that, and a little bit of stepping back from that on his foreign policy that would be nice to see as well.
Right.
Next, had the idea of a populist president, and populist, somebody who just appeals to the masses rather than running on a particular platform or principle, and the idea, of a populist is also basically I'm not one of them, so I want to get them all thrown out. Where Trump, he came in as a businessman and had never served in any other government capacity. He was the first president to never have served in in any government capacity, whether in the military or any other lower government position. And so, in that regard, I think it's nice that he's an outsider. I'm cautious to see not just what are they going to tear down, but how are they going to make it stick. To if we fire 70% of our federal workers and dismantle, let's say 250 of the federal agencies out of we've got an incredible number of federal
Hmm.
agencies, and we dismantle a bunch of those. That's all well and good, and toss those people back into our economy, and let's get used to the way that our economy should be functioning. But what are we going to do in its place? And yeah, so I guess that's all I had on that.
Yeah, and with populist too is, there seems to be that the majority of people obviously have voted for Trump to be the president, not just the Electoral College. That was, 8 years ago. That's what the Democrats were saying. Well, he's not the most popular. They were decrying the Electoral College, and so for Trump to win both the Electoral College and the first time, a Republican has won the popular vote as well is a huge thing that people are saying, and that gives uh, power to what in authority to what he's trying to do in Washington, both now and actually when he gets in office. for the Republicans that are in office in the House and the Senate, for them to get behind Trump, because they know some of them, they only got to their positions of power on his coattails. He dragged them across the finish line. And so they've got to follow along with him, and then uh, to understand too that his ideas seem to be what the majority of people want. Because I've seen some memes about this, of where the states that voted for Kamala Harris, they're the West Coast and the East Coast, and then the map was drawn of here's Canada, extend Canada down along Washington, Oregon, down to California, and then on the eastern coast, and then Canada can have all that, and then all of a sudden, everything south of that in the U.S. is red. So there's that populist idea, and then to see again, uh, I think that the populist would be for a lot of the cuts that the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, is going to do. Because an article I read this week on Not the Bee, I encourage all of you to listen to read it. It showed that only 3% of federal workers are coming into the office in Washington, D.C. 3%. You know, I like being able to not come to church all the time to work. I can do a lot of my work from home on my phone and my computer and so forth. And a lot of people can do those kinds of things. But understanding for our government that we have huge buildings, expensive, fancy buildings, and rightfully so, and then they're not full. And then what Musk said, that 3% is actually not an accurate number either, because it's taking into account the janitors and the security. If you take those people out who are there all the time protecting the buildings and cleaning the buildings, it's down to 1%. And like Trump did with, I mean, what Musk did with his Tesla Corporation and Twitter, if you're not going to come in, that's what he said with Tesla. If you're not going to come in, you're not going to have a job. And if they do that, imagine all of these federal employees gone. They're back in the regular workforce. But then what does that mean for us? Our taxes should go down, because we're uh, funding this glut of the federal bureaucracy that really maybe not doing all that much,
Yeah, in theory.
in theory.
Wouldn't that be grand? And I guess that's the other part is when we talk about tariffs and the government efficiency side, that people are saying, well, maybe prices will go up on all these things that you've been accustomed to, an artificially low price on your computer, your phone, whatever the case may be. But if we can also cut taxes at the same time as imposing tariffs, and there might be a little bit of transition time in there, but hopefully it benefits our economy as well as national resiliency, so that when there is an emergency, like in early COVID, and they're like, we don't even make masks here anymore, and China isn't giving us any. Just as an example, that we've got the natural resources and we've got the people to be able to produce the things that we need, and that I do think lends to a little bit more national resiliency, whether it's weather events like hurricanes and snowstorms, but the ability to say that we can produce what we need here. And that with so many more people involved in the production of these things, that we can also export to places that need it or that want to buy it.
Yeah, and when we're talking about populist ideas too, of saying, hey, what uh, Trump is proposing, it seems to have hit a nerve with people. It doesn't really matter what the race is, because more black men voted for Trump than have for Republicans in the past. It was like 40 to 50% of Hispanics voted for Trump. Men and women, that the Democrats were going for white women, and they voted for Trump. So it is a big mix of races and cultures and men and women. So that's a big thing. And to understand that people see that this is important. It's
Mhm.
not the apathy that we've seen in the past. And even you and I talk about this all the time of apathy of Christians and apathy of pastors. Uh, on Monday, I talked with a guy who was a new prospect of our church, and we had gone to Starbucks to have coffee and meet. This tells you how often we go to Starbucks. Uh, that I don't ever pay for coffee, but this time I did. I paid for our coffees. We went in, ordered our coffees, and realized, oh, there's no place to sit down in this Starbucks. So then we had to go to McDonald's. There's places, and so on the way there, I followed him, and when we got into the restaurant and sat down, I said, "Hey, I liked your bumper sticker. It was a Trump Vance bumper sticker." And he was more than welcome and more than willing to start talking politics with the pastor. Other people that I have in different Bible studies, whether it's longtime members or whether it's my adult confirmation classes where they've only known me a few weeks, they will ask questions on politics. They know I'm not afraid to talk about it and apply scriptural principles to it. And I think that's a populist idea too. Saying the people are interested, they're engaged. And I think Trump has done a good job. It seems, 12 years of being involved with politics of just getting normal people interested in these things.
Oh, definitely. And then to think clearly about them, to say, there's a time to speak up and maybe a time to resist or a time to build something new. And usually those times happen more quickly than we realize or that we find comfortable. Whether you're talking about the first book that you wrote, Resisting the Dragon's Beast, and that idea of resisting to an unjust law, with the criteria from the Magdeburg Confession, and that the time for resistance is usually when it is both unpopular and difficult, and we want to push it off down the road and say, well, it's all adiaphoron, and as though it's a very simple and very tightly closed box of when we open a box of resisting a government injunction of some sort, and I think when we get into politics and we start talking about some of those things in relation to our Christian lives, then it opens the discussion a little bit more to say, wait a second, let's think clearly about the times. Let's count the cost and think clearly about the times in which we live, so that we aren't going to be caught unawares in 2 or 3 years down the road. But we can at least discuss some of these things now.
Yeah, and that populist idea too, just talking to young people. God's blessed us with these bunch of new people that have just found our church in the last 2 months, and they're interested in Christianity, but also they're interested in politics and the tie with that. I think of the same thing with my daughters. All four of my daughters, from 18 to 27, they want to talk to their dad about these kind of things because they're living these things, and they see some of their friends. My four daughters have obviously lady friends, and ladies right now are more liberal. And so even though they may go to conservative colleges, they have liberal friends. How do I talk to them about these kind of things? And because my daughters are just as conservative politically as I am, and uh, so they want to talk about these kind of things because they see how Christianity influences politics, and they can understand too how the government and the policies of the government can affect the Christian church and their lives as Christians. That's a powerful thing. That's populist.
Yeah, definitely. Next one, talking about honor and respect for the elected. That, when Paul says, fear God, honor the king, and the idea of submission to the governing authorities and honoring the governing authorities, that is a higher calling than mere obedience. That's a higher calling than simply doing what they say and coloring within the lines. And for the Christian, that we ought to pray for our leadership, pray that they act and govern to the best of their ability and in a godly way, and pray that they uphold natural design as God has designed us to be men and women, male and female, or pray that enact laws that serve to curb our sinful natures. Pray for all those things as well. But honor and respect for the elected, whether it was President Trump or if the election had gone the other way and President Harris would be the one taking over in January, that the Christian, even though we follow these things, we don't need to be so obsessed and worried about them the way that the rest of the world does. I
Hmm.
guess that's my thing.
Yeah, we have gotten into this mindset. If I am talking about President Trump and I'm for President Trump, that means everyone else on the other side is bad. No, I should be willing to say, hey, I like President Trump. I like his policies, and that's good because he's my president. Now, if it was President Biden or President Harris, okay, I may not have the same enthusiasm for him or her, and yet I have to show that same respect. And just because I may not like him or her or that elected leader, uh, I need to be willing to be respectful about that president or other elected leaders. And I think we've gotten so far away of talking any politics in the Christian church that when you say anything, well, you're automatically going to turn someone off, as
Yeah.
opposed to being willing to talk all the time. And I think uh, if we fairly say, all right, I did not agree with, say, President Biden with his pardon of his son. You know, I don't mind pardoning his son for his crimes, but when it's an open-ended pardon for anything he has done or might do, okay, that's wrong. And now there's things. Uh, Another story I read today that President Biden might pardon a whole bunch of other people. Well, proactive pardons, pardons for people that haven't been accused of any crimes because they think, well, that President Trump goes into office. I don't think you can do that with a pardon. Okay. And so it's okay to call it out. If there's, and if Trump, I would say for Trump, he should pardon people from January 6th, uh, from a couple of years ago, but he shouldn't do blanket ones because there are some people who deserve some of the punishment that they've received, and there's others that where the Department of Justice came down unfairly on them.
Mhm.
And so if he would just blanket to everyone, I would go out and say, I don't think that's right. Okay. But when we don't ever say anything, then that's not right. And we're always, always a Lutheran middle road. But because we don't ever say anything, Peter, as pastors or as people, because we don't ever talk about these things, then that gets to the whole point of, honor and respect. We're not honoring or respecting our leaders because we're not even talking about them.
hmm And part of honor and respect means recognizing our responsibility to them, not only to speak well of them and pray for them, but also in this American system, you have a responsibility to be informed and to contact people on lower levels or to interact with your government. That's part of the U.S. citizenship test on how does an American citizen interact with their government, and that we have a responsibility to do so. And whether that is, and there's a variety of things that they provide as potential answers, whether it's peacefully protesting or writing something that people can read, like in a newspaper editorial or whatever we do in place of newspapers, but that we don't want to be so distanced from the interacting with our governing systems that we just dismiss it and say, you know what, I don't have to worry about that because my citizenship is in heaven. Well, it is, but your citizenship is also here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you've got a responsibility here, not to just, toss it all by the wayside and say, not a big deal. I'm not going to worry about that right now.
Yeah. Uh, it, it bugs me when pastors say this all the time. They go, I just preach Jesus. Well, yeah, I preach. That's very pietistic sounding. I preach Jesus too. Jesus preached Jesus, obviously, but he also preached Jesus and then how to live as a Jesus follower. And that's the part that those who are pious and saying, well, I just preach Jesus. No, I preach Jesus in a political system, which is the left-hand kingdom, the civil government. So, Peter, did you watch that video I sent you today with the Billy Madison clip?
No, because I didn't want to log into Instagram.
Okay. Yeah, my associate had that issue too. He said, I'm not young enough and hip enough to be in Instagram. So I'll describe the clip for you. So it's from Billy Madison, I believe. So you've got the Billy Madison character who's,
A
full-grown
height of
adult.
humor.
It's in
One of the
grades.
best movies ever.
Okay, so he's in grade school going through the classes, but he's like in kindergarten. He's playing dodgeball with these little kindergartners, and he's just going all out and just whipping the dodgeball at these kids. Well, except that uh, in the video they had President Trump, his name above Billy Madison, and then when he's chucking the balls at the kids, he's chucking the ball at the DOJ, at the FBI, at Hunter Biden, at the CDC, and so forth. And we might say, "Oh, that's really cruel," except if there's a reason for the president to go after those institutions, that's justice. And
Mhm.
that's a good thing. And we as Christians should be all about our government being right and just and fair because that's their whole job. The problem is, and this goes to some of the other things we've talked about, they've taken over so many other areas of our lives that we can't do anything without the government being involved. That's not the way that the government should be. The government should be focused on a few things like protection and fairness, justice. And if they're not going to be fair and just, well, then Lord willing, God allows the right leaders to get in there to bring about fairness and justice. And if that
Definitely.
means chucking some dodgeballs at some people, so be it.
And humor is one of the areas that that seems to have a little bit of extra protection for being able to get your point across and say it clearly, without ruffling, all the wrong feathers. Sometimes I wonder to what extent do we actually have a First Amendment,
Hmm.
but we can talk about that another time. But then back on the pardons.
Okay.
I think this sets a very hazardous, dangerous precedent. Not to use that terminology, but I can't think of anything else. It's distressing to say that you are pardoned for something that I'm not going to name
Hmm.
and something that might not have happened or even something that might happen in the future, because it's part of our legal system, which traces all the way back to English common law, is that if you are accused, you have the right to confront your accuser in court. And even the Sixth Amendment guarantees the right to confront witnesses in court and cross-examine them. It guarantees some other criminal rights too, such as the right to a lawyer, a public trial, and an impartial jury. But if we say in our system that somebody can be pardoned for something that they may or may not have done sometime during this whole decade-long period of time, whether that includes the future or not, that is the same thing as 1984 saying that you are guilty of a thought crime,
Hmm.
because it's saying now you are not guilty of something that you may or may not have done. That is just the other side of the coin from saying you are guilty of something that you may or may not have done. And you are guilty, and we're not going to name what it was. Obviously, you and I both know that you are guilty, that you've done it. It goes against, there's a reason that it goes against every other presidential pardon, because the presidential pardon is supposed to be ordered according to the form of our legal system, where you have an accusation, you can confront your accuser, and then there's going to be justice and a judgment. And I think that's the really interesting part. How I think it's going to be discussed for a long time.
Yeah, and I think from what I understand of past pardons too, most of the people that have been pardoned have already served some kind of time and so forth. Uh, and maybe they're done or they're still serving the time, but they've paid some kind of penalty in the past. This is Hunter Biden hasn't received any penalty. He hasn't seen a single moment of jail.
All,
Whereas,
all we've heard is that the laptop was a Russian plant.
yeah. And, again, tying everything into Christianity, you and I as Christians, we do receive a pardon from God. But I like what you said, Peter, is that when there's a pardon, you should have, in the legal system in our civil government, you should have listed what the crime is. All right, I'm going to pardon you from that crime. But in this instance, there wasn't with Hunter Biden. For us, God very definitely says this is what you do, what you've done is wrong. That's the whole book. Since there's two books in heaven, I always call the one book that's unnamed the book of the damned. And that book of the damned has the list of everything every unbeliever's done wrong. By God's grace, you and I have been pardoned, meaning that everything that we've done wrong has been blotted out by the blood of Christ. And now only our names are written in the book of life. But uh, the unbelievers, they have everything written down. And so there's that, equating the two kingdoms.
Definitely. My number two of our top five, language and defining the pattern of culture. And where this kind of came in, I know Matt Walsh had something about this a couple weeks ago, but if you go on Twitter, one of the representatives from the state of New York.
So you're okay going on Twitter, but not going on Instagram?
No. I read about what people have written
Okay.
on Twitter.
Okay.
And where Andrea Ocasio-Cortez, or whatever her first name is, I forget, I'm sorry, where she took her pronouns out of her official bio on Twitter. And just the idea that the world around us wants to say at the same time that words don't matter, but you have to talk this way because words don't matter. It's like talking out of both sides of one's mouth, where they say, well, why can't you just be nice and refer to this person as a woman? Why can't you just be nice? Because words don't matter anyway. You should just say this. But language defines the pattern of culture. And so in our churches, we have a set of language that seeks to respectfully convey spiritual truths in a sanctified way with proper reverence and respect. I go by Pastor Hagen. I'm not just, Pastor Pete or the guy up front. And I mean, kind of the way that I think of that is, what do you call your doctor? Is he Dr. Jim or is he Dr. Burke? It's a professional thing, but it's also demonstrating that, we do have respect for obviously the God who is above us all, but that same God has given to us people that he has placed in positions of authority. And we don't like to hear that. We don't like to hear that somebody has authority over us. But that's part of the idea that God wants to build a certain culture among his believers, and language is part and parcel of that.
Yeah, and then the way I took it with the culture is I wanted to read this. This is from, again, not the B, and this is from Senator Mike Lee that wrote these on Twitter. And I thought you'd be interested in this, Peter, because I know you're more of a history buff than I am. He writes, in a meeting today with Elon Musk and Vivek and Speaker Johnson, Elon and Vivek referred to the fact that because unelected bureaucrats now make most federal law and control much of our economy, we've been stripped of the benefits of a constitutional republic. As Vivek noted, the need for Americans to demand accountability from their own government is precisely why we fought and mercifully won the American Revolution. That got me thinking. Throughout Anglo-American history, we've seen a major upheaval every 75 to 90 years. It's almost like clockwork. Each pivot in American history has been kickstarted by events in just 3 critical years. By my reckoning, those years were 1776, 1861, and 1937. These aren't just random years, they're game changers. So to make this fun, I'm going to test your history knowledge and what happened in these years. So, Peter, in 1776, what happened?
The signing of the Declaration of Independence.
Okay, we declared our independence from a large, distant government that recognized no limits on its authority and refused to hold itself accountable to the American people. Sound familiar, he writes. 1861.
The firing on Fort Sumter.
So in 1861, the American Civil War began, hastening the end of a tragic chapter of our history when many Americans owned other Americans as property, as slaves, with the approval and protection of government. 1937. That's a harder one.
That is. Is that when FDR tried to, he repossessed the gold in this nation and reset our U.S. currency?
I think it's something along those lines. So he writes in 1937, progressives in all three branches of the U.S. government, with one final push from the Supreme Court, dangerously eroded the Constitution's twin structural protections, the vertical protection we call federalism and the horizontal protection known as separation of powers, all to facilitate FDR's quest to centralize power in the federal government in response to the Great Depression. Uh,
I think that oh boy, I thought it was a little bit earlier. Maybe 1934 was we're talking about the National Firearms Act 1934, 1937. That was probably when the Supreme Court finally caved into pressure from FDR and basically said we're not going to care about the 10th Amendment anymore, and that the federal government does have the right to do all these things that are normally reserved to the states. But because this is an emergency, we will take this power for ourselves.
yep.
It was a lot of back and forth through most of the 30s on that one.
Yeah, and then there's just a few more. In the nearly 88 years since the Supreme Court opened this era on April 12th, 1937, the day the court redefined Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce so broadly that nothing remained of federalism, and indirectly set in motion Congress's now common habit of delegating lawmaking power to unelected bureaucrats, Americans have lost much of their power to control their own destiny to people in Washington, D.C. We're about to have another one of those years, one that could initiate the reversal of the immense harm that has been unleashed on the American people by their own government, no less, ever since April 12th, 1937. Brace yourselves because 2025 is shaping up to be the next big pivotal year, only the fourth in our 248-year history as a country. We're on the cusp of setting in motion a new, brighter era for America. And then two more.
Hmm.
It's nearly impossible to fire these federal bureaucrats. They enjoy so much insulation from the citizens they govern that King George III, the tyrant whose excesses triggered the American Revolution, would be green with envy were he alive and able to observe. It's time to put the people back in charge. So that's where I look at with culture and why I'm excited with what uh, President Trump is planning on doing. I mean, I was excited to get him in there. I'm even more excited to hear about the kinds of things that he wants to do. And for me, the culture, uh, Christianity should influence the culture, but government influences culture too because it's morality, and that's your last point, but
Hmm.
also uh, just getting rid of bureaucracy of again, I read an article the other day saying of how much, if we got rid of bureaucracy, that Americans would be making like four times, the economy would be four times greater than it is now. And that all of those shows that we grew up with that were looking at the future, like the Jetsons, we might have those kinds of things now, but they're so almost impossible to get through because we have to go through so many levels of bureaucracy.
Yeah, and I can't disagree with that.
Yeah. So that's one of those things that I think of with culture, just getting rid of stuff. Think of even the bureaucracy of just trying to do stuff in your own home. Putting up a wall, changing a wall, getting a shed, putting up a chicken coop. That those are things now uh, you need to go to the town hall, city hall, and you got to get a permit and so forth. And you don't want to be a lawbreaker, but you also want to say, this is my house. This is my property. Why does the government have anything having to have a say on my property? And those are the kinds of things, or even just this is a weird thing for me to do with a couple of my daughters the day before Thanksgiving, that they're looking at concealed carry because they go hiking and so forth by themselves
Mhm.
and to have something to protect themselves. And I understand the government wanting to know if you have guns and so forth, but I also understand why I wouldn't want the government to know if we have guns and so forth, because that's the whole idea of the Second Amendment. Uh, and so, but those are the things that we should be talking about and should be debating. I'm not smart enough to know the answer on either one of those things, but we don't have those discussions, and I don't think our government has those discussions either. Once a rule is in place, like you said, with 1937, an emergency rule, it's supposed to be temporary. It doesn't stay emergency, and it's not temporary. It becomes permanent.
Yeah, and I guess that leads really well into our last one about the need to have a framework of morality, that our entire Constitution is based on the idea that a moral people can govern themselves. And a moral, and then they set up some safeguards, obviously, with the system of checks and balances. But it's based on the idea that you are a moral person, that you will act morally in your relationship to your neighbor. It doesn't have to mean that you are a Christian, but that in an outward way, that you will act in a morally correct way, in line with the natural knowledge of God, in line with the laws of the land, which ought to reflect the law of God. And the idea that when we have discarded, here's kind of the scary part. If we discard a moral framework, talked about this just in Bible class a few minutes ago, so bear with me. The idea of modernism says that there is a truth that applies to everybody, and we can figure it out by reason. The idea of postmodernism says that truth resides within each individual person, and so truth is really only found in your emotions. And that sounds workable until you get to the injection of power. And the real truth of postmodernism is that if truth is only within my heart, then it's going to be a power struggle for me trying to enforce my truth on you. And politically, this is the scary part, because if somebody has a set of morals that are immoral, and they are the ones who have authority, then they can enforce that immorality on others. And they don't have the personal safeguards to say, I'm not going to go there, I'm not going to do that. But rather, you can just other the other person. That is a subhuman. They're deplorable, or they're totally backwards, or like FDR did with all of the Japanese American citizens who were put into different internment camps because they aren't like us. And if you don't have a moral safeguard, then there's no moral break for those who have power. And then you're just at the mercy of those who have power. Because if you don't have an objective truth and you don't have a moral framework, then it's just a question of who gets to enforce their own personal morality or immorality on others. And so it's kind of scary. It's kind of uncharted territory, at least in my life here in the United States, to say that that we would disregard so much of the natural knowledge of God and human reason in our law. And I think that was the big thing that, at least social issue, that helped to push Trump to the forefront. Wasn't the left. Kamala Harris thought the big issue was abortion and abortion rights. The biggest social issue seems to have been transgenderism. Like, let's get men and boys out of our girls' sports. Because, again, 15 years ago, President Obama eviscerated Title IX, but that's another discussion.
Yeah, and that's a good segue with the transgenderism, because that's what I was going to bring up, in that I know you are a Supreme Court junkie. So have you been paying attention to the case that's before the Supreme Court right now, Peter? Uh, because the
Yes.
case that's in front of the Supreme Court is one on transgenderism, uh, where you have a person the last name is Strangio, and when you look at the person, you go, there is something a little strange. Well, that's because this is a lady pretending to be a guy, taking hormones and so forth to make some facial hair and so forth. You listen to the voice. It's not a man's voice. It's not really even a woman's voice. It's something that's been changed. But so now you've got a person in front of the Supreme Court trying to argue that transgenderism and having puberty blockers and these surgeries for children, that these are rights that are part of the Constitution. Thankfully, God has allowed us to have a conservative court. So, Lord willing, this is just going to be uh, thrown out and or tried, uh, and that the conservative idea of that this is chopping up the body, that this is wrong, that morality, but even that will win out, that morality, but just the fact that it's there before the highest court of the land demonstrates just how immoral that we've become, that we have someone who is immoral, someone who is obviously not Christian, was an atheist, someone who's made the body, their God, and then brought by the ACLU, which is not Christian, which is very demonic in the way that the things that they do is pushing this whole idea of transgenderism onto our nation. But to be able to see all these things, yeah, it is a blow against morality.
And that we're not Gnostics. We don't separate the person as like I'm a soul with a body. No, you're a whole person. And we're not Gnostics, where we don't separate like I'm a Christian and I'm a U.S. citizen. Well, you're an American and you are a Christian. You're a Christian American. And I would say, kind of circling back to what you've mentioned earlier previously, that some people would say, well, Mike Zarling, you are mixing the two kingdoms. When you're talking about so much politics, and I just preach Jesus, but you talk a little bit too much about politics here, and I think a suitable answer from you would be, well, okay, but I'm not a Gnostic. I don't think that I can just talk about Jesus as with no connection to where we live and specific application for how we ought to live as lights in this dark world today. Like, we've got a truth that the world needs to hear, and a truth that is increasingly different. That, maybe in the next generation, maybe this generation, that Christians will be the only ones with big families, more than 2 kids. Christians will be the only ones raising disabled children. Christians will be the only ones who will be caring for those with mental impairments. Christians will be the only ones with old people that they care for.
Yeah.
Because Christians value lives. And that's part and parcel of it, that we're not Gnostics. I'm done.
I encourage you, Peter and others, to listen to some of the exchange in the Supreme Court. I was listening to a little bit yesterday, and to hear Strange, the lawyer, arguing, there are questions by one of the justices about, is this, transgenderism, is it immutable, that it can't change? And because they're trying to, the ACLU with their lawyers trying to make this like blacks and having the right to vote and so forth. And that your skin color, that does not change. That is immutable. And so one of the justices asked the lawyer, well, is your gender, is your sex immutable? And this person, she went on to explain, well, yeah, sometimes you can change from one gender to another. That's her language, one gender to another. Sometimes it might even change in the same day. And then for the judge to say, well, then if it changes, that is not immutable. And just striking down her whole argument. And striking down the argument, well, it has to be fair. Like, again, with the African Americans, it wasn't fair that they weren't able to vote, but only white people could. They're right. That's why that law changed. Then they're trying to say, well, that boys that want to have these drugs, that they can't get them, and maybe for this reason, but these girls that feel they're transgender, they can get these drugs. And then again, the Supreme Court just said, see, that's not fair and equal. That everyone should be able to get everything. And it's just hearing, I didn't listen a whole lot because I don't like listening to dumb people making dumb arguments, but to be able to, so I have to put myself and have to suffer through the dumb arguments to be able to listen to uh, some of the very smart people on the Supreme Court
Hmm.
with their very well thought out and reasoned ways of just shutting down. The problem is there are also some Supreme Court justices that are not very smart, and listening to some of them and some of their arguments, going in my mind thinking, all right, a high school debate team could do better arguments than what you're doing as supposedly one of the smartest people in the United States sitting on the Supreme Court. But just that whole idea of morality, conscience, and laying all this groundwork out. Thank goodness we have a few senators, a few political leaders, a few justices that still have that morality and conscience.
Definitely.
And with that too, one thing, because I was asked this last week in Bible study, my thought on there's a couple of states that have pushed to get the Bible back into grade schools. And they were wondering what my thoughts were. And because we've been raised for so long with the idea, well, we should not have the Bible in schools. And what some of these governors and so forth are getting at is to get the Bible back in school is not to teach Christianity, because you can't do that. That's the First Amendment. But to say our children cannot understand our nation's history. They can't understand our founding documents. They can't even understand great literature, like Tom Sawyer, uh, Huck Finn, some of the great works of fiction of our nation, or even in other historical documents before the founding of our nation. You can't understand any of that without having a groundwork of scripture. And
And
so,
and you need like reading literature like that, including the Bible, to really have a grasp on logic and
mhm,
how thought is supposed to be formulated and how thought is supposed to work.
yeah. And so I think putting that logic there uh, by having scripture. And so, yeah, I told our member who asked the question, what do you think about having Bibles back in classrooms? Absolutely. Okay. Because what happens when we don't have the Bible? Well, the devil's always going to fill the void. And so the kids and the schools are not going to remain morally neutral. That that is a false idea that we fall into. I think we fall into that as Christians too. No, there's only two sides in the spiritual war, as the Apostle Paul says. Uh, our fight is not against principalities and or our fight is against principalities and powers in the heavenly realms. It's either God, His word, His angels, or it's Satan, self, and his angels. It's one or the other. And so anything that we can do to get morality back, well, morality comes from God's word. And so any way we can get God's word uh, into the hearts and minds of our people, that's what changes the culture. So,
Hmm. Definitely. So yeah,
all right.
we'll have a lot to look at when the ruling on this the Supreme Court case finally comes through, as well as a number of other interesting ones. In the last session and also this session, there's another Second Amendment case, which is like the hotbed for political jurisprudence today. Like you, I was probably a little surprised to see that a case about transgenderism made it all the way to the Supreme Court, because even under our current law, minors don't have the capacity to provide informed consent, and they don't have the legality to provide informed consent. And there would be a lot of informed consent that would have to go on before somebody could say, yes, I will forego going through puberty in favor of this idea that I've got about how my body ought to be configured.
Yeah, and then even another case, but this is in New York, that the Daniel Penny case is deadlocked uh, with the jury, just to see where that ends up, because that's going to have a big play. Again, talking about morality, because Daniel Penny was protecting the others on the subway, and yet after he put the guy in the headlock, and then he's arrested for murder, And then there's others in New York who say, where are all the men? How come they're not stepping up and protecting people? And so I think that's a good topic for us to talk about too, is what do we do as Christians? Do we do what God calls us to do and being good Samaritans? But understanding if we're living in a culture right now that means, hey, if we step up as good Samaritans, we could end up in jail for it.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's kind of where I'm at.
yeah, and there's
That
another one of uh, down in Georgia where a mom was arrested for allowing her child to be free range, going out and walking
to
away.
walk a couple blocks down the road. Come
Yeah, a
on.
mile. Yeah. So I think those are good things for us to talk about too,
Definitely.
because uh, I pay attention to those things, but also because Peter, I know you love all the court cases.
Oh, yeah, love it, hate it, and I mean, my bottom line is children belong to their parents and not to anybody else. And even we as Christians don't believe that because we sure don't act like it.
Right.
That sounds
All right.
like a
Well,
rant for another time.
we got a couple of things to talk about next time. So, all right. Well, thank you for your top 10, Peter, and Lord's blessings on your Advent season, Peter, and all of our listeners' Advent season. And we look forward to getting together very soon.